Hey, everybody.
Presenting Benny Goodman and his music.
Here we go. Wait a sec. Oh, crap. Hey, folks. The title's a little off here. I know I updated it hours ago, but it is pretty much that correct, so we'll just go with it. Lonely Miles. Hey, Marine. Hey, Alexandra. Timothy, Larry. Hey, everybody.
Benny Goodman, ladies and gentlemen, the man with the torrid clarinet and the even more torrid band who purveys assorted rhythms, all danceable, in the urban room of the Congress Hotel.
Hey, Mona. Hey, Karen.
And first of all, one of Irving Berlin's greatest hits, Blue Skies.
Evening, everybody. Well, here comes Miles. Miles. Yeah. Hey, Betsy. Hey, Timothy, Dina. Hey, Cindy in Los Angeles. Yep, new sign. Ronnie got me this. Cool, huh? Hey, Casey. Hey, Bridget and Mary Jo. Hey, Miles. Miles wants all the attention right now. Hey, Mark and Karen. The sign's still a little, even at its darkest setting, it's still a little too bright for the camera purposes. It can get a little fuzzy, but I got some window tinting film coming tomorrow. We're going to make this thing work because it looks too cool not to use. Oh, Miles. Yeah, Ronnie got me the new sign. Hey, Heather. Hey, Rodney, Diane, Heather, Megan, Jennifer, anybody I might have missed. Ah. Hey, CL. Miles. There's a fine time to decide you want all the attention. Hey, everybody. Hey, Beth. Miles, watch it. Watch the keyboard, please. Yeah, Miles is kind of wound up. He'll probably calm down. Oh, look, here's Priya. Poking her head around, seeing what's going on in here. Hey, Priya. Lily's probably hanging out with Ronnie right now. Ethan Miguel. Hey, Joanne, Diane, anybody I might have missed? Hey, Jordana. Hey, John.
Singing With All My Heart.
And Marie. Has been a while since I had a new one here. Octavio's tardy? Well, we're going to put that on his report card, of course. Is there a date for the field study for tonight's class? Yes, November 8th, 1878. Marvelous thing on the fireplace is the new neon sign that Ronnie got me. It may still be a little too bright. I may have to turn it off if it's really buzzing too much later, but that should all be resolved by next week. I am committed. I bought a dimmer switch today to try to make it dimmer than the lowest setting. Did not work. I say I love you dearly, for I am yours sincerely with all my heart. I love neon. I do. Octavio, this is going to go on your permanent record. What do you want to do with your life? Hey, Grandma Belle. Diane, that's good news. Evening, Steve. Oh, yeah, you can see those. Miles and Priya are just about ready to throw down. They'll run back through, I'm sure. Gene, that's something. I don't think I've ever seen that. Evening, Kim. Evening, everybody.
Benny Goodman goes away back and
Hey, Liz.
a lot of rhythm out of Walk, Jenny Walk. Benny Goodman and his orchestra.
Hey, Gene. I got bad news for you guys. Tonight we don't use shovels. We're using trowels. I bet there's one down in the basement I can find. Down in the shared space in the basement. I have no trowel of my own, but it seems like the kind of thing my upstairs neighbors might have. But no time. You all know what a garden spade looks like. That'd be out of the butt, Bob. Out of Centipede's poop. Gloves, I definitely recommend gloves. Or if you don't have a copy of the New York Herald to wipe your hands on. Evening, Liz. Hey, Cindy. You guys have some great stories about unusual, unexpected critters pooping. They shouldn't be unexpected. Everyone poops. There's a whole REM song about it. Hey, Patty. Hey, Betty. Hooks tonight would make an even bigger mess, I'm afraid. Hey, Amy. Cherry bombs might work, but no, this is an urban grave robbing.
And they all loved it. They all loved those bastards when they played.
Hey, Rose. Evening, Paula.
And now another one.
Hey, Paula.
Same vein. Rosetta.
No, nothing good starts in a getaway car. Jamie, having a dog help would actually work really well in this particular one. There's no bells on the collars or anything, nothing jingly. Hey, Gwendolyn and Frederick. The title should be Grave Robbing 102, but for some reason it didn't update, as occasionally it does not. This is what I'm paying him $15 a month for. Hey, Aaron. No, definitely no tiki torches, Susan. We want to keep attention to a minimum here. Gene, that is new. Ronnie got me that. Lynn, I did not know that gorillas have very small testicles, but how are their scrotums? Are they like is the whole package small, or is it just like a big scrotum with not much in there? All right, Bella, just sliding in on time. Evening, Lisa in Kenosha.
Music by Benny Goodman is being presented from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel in downtown Chicago.
All right.
Benny Goodman's arrangement of The Bugle Call Rang.
This is the point at which we pause the Benny Goodman and move on to our regularly scheduled program. Welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam for Mysterious Chicago Tours, as it says on the cool neon sign that Ronnie got me. Here at Mysterious Chicago, we drink in neon nights, miss all of the stars. There's your Broadway reference, but you'll have to Google that one. All right, so welcome along, everybody. I'm Adam from Mysterious Chicago Tours. I've been a tour guide and historian in Chicago and New York for going on 20 years now. Got about a dozen Chicago history books out, including Mysterious Chicago, the book, H.H. Holmes, The True History of the White City Devil, Murder Maps USA from Thames and Hudson, and most recently, Graceland Cemetery, Chicago Stories, Symbols, and Secrets. Currently working on Graveyards of Manhattan for a publisher that I'll be announcing probably pretty soon, as long as we can agree on all the terms in the contract, which is looking pretty good. I've never negotiated my own contract before. It's a very interesting new skill set to pick up. But now these books are just blocking that really cool sign, so let's put these down and let that thing shine through. So one of the very first walking tours that I did was called Grave Robbing 101. The whole thing was all about the history, theory, and practice and appreciation of grave robbing all around Lincoln Park, the old city cemetery in Chicago. Eventually, I expanded it in a New York version of that one as well, which is totally different stories. It's the same tips and tricks for how to launch your career as a 19th century body snatcher today, but totally different stories, and really from a whole different era, too. I mean, in New York, we're mostly talking about 1700 stuff, which really never comes up when we're talking about Chicago things. So, one of the first virtual tours we did, naturally, was Grave Robbing 101 3 years ago. And for years now, people have been asking me about Grave Robbing 102. When are we going to get to part 2 of this class? Well, this is what it's going to be. Last time I was in New York, I finally had a chance to check out St. Mark's of the Bowery. That was the site of one of the most infamous grave robbing incidents of the 19th century. So now that I've got all the footage from there, I decided it was time. It's time for Grave Robbing 102. I hope you all have your transcripts. Hope you all remembered everything you learned, but in case you missed stuff, in case you missed or forgot the last class or just slacked off all summer, We'll do a very brief recap here of Grave Robbing 101. Grave Robbing 101, well, the reason most people robbed graves over the course of the last couple of centuries was to get cadavers for medical schools. In doing this, to drive up their prices to 50 or 60 bucks a night per corpse, they had to come up with some interesting terms. Both the media and the grave robbers themselves came up with all kinds of terms. Things like resurrection man, body snatcher, ghoul. I also like hyena, that came up now and then. And purveyor of meat specializing in long pig, or professional subject gatherer. Now, a really good grave robber could get 5 or 6 corpses in one night. That's like 300 bucks. That's like close to a year's salary for somebody working in the coal mines, all for one night of work. This was fairly good money, plus you were aiding medical science. We're going to run through once again, really quickly, some of the tools that you were going to need. Most obvious is a shovel. You also need a hook to poke through the eyes to drag the body up on a rope. You will need a knife for cutting off the clothes. That's very important too. If you leave the clothes behind, sometimes you can skirt through various loopholes legally. You will need some cash for bribing the sexton. The sexton was almost invariably, like the guy here in this Dickens illustration, was almost invariably drunk and easy to bribe. The number one tip is always bribe the sexton. The sexton was like the cemetery manager. Very frequently, for a couple of bucks, they would show you where to dig and guard you from the cops. Show you the bodies that you could dig up that didn't die of something like smallpox that might still be catching. You didn't want to dig up a smallpox body. And of course, a really good grave robber could, the real most important trick is you don't have to dig out the entire grave. You don't have to pull the whole coffin up. You just dig down, cut a hole into the head of the coffin, put that hook that you brought along through the eyes, and drag it up on the rope that you brought along. The more you know. So all of these things led to an incident in the 1700s outside of Trinity Church in Manhattan. Right across the street from that and up a couple of blocks up, was the old, what is now City Hall Park. At the time, it was the site of Columbia College, recently renamed from King's College because in 1788 we didn't have a king anymore. Now, early in 1788, an advertisement came up in the paper. $100 reward, whereas one night last week the grave of a person recently interred in Trinity Churchyard was opened and the corpse with a part of the clothes were carried off. Any person who will discover the offenders so that they may be convicted and brought to justice will receive the above reward from the Corporation of Trinity Church by order of the vestry, Robert C. Livingston, Treasurer. Robert C. Livingston has a vault of his own at Trinity Church, but possibly because of stuff like this, is not, in fact, interred there. He's interred in a family vault where he probably assumed he'd be safer. Incorrectly, somebody broke into that in the early 20th century. But a couple of months after this, in 1788, people figured out where the medical schools were getting all of their corpses. And this led to a full-on riot known now as the Doctors' Mob. Articles these days usually call it the Doctors' Riot. At the time, it was generally known as the Doctors' Mob, in which a band of our founding fathers, likely including Alexander Hamilton, held off a mob of people who were out to harass and even kill every doctor in town, digging through all of their stuff, trying to find all of their specimens. So most of this, the worst of it, went down in what is now City Hall Park, right across from Trinity and St. Paul's. So here's City Hall Park as it appears today. Nice space. And if we proceed just a block or so up from here, we've got this large building up at the corner of Broadway and Rector. Broadway and Chambers. This is a building from 1848 that was known as the Marble Palace. 280 Broadway, later the clock from when it was the home of the New York Sun, a newspaper in the early 20th century. The place was built by a guy by the name of A.T. Stewart. A.T. Stewart was the merchandising king of the era, revolutionized the concept of the department store with his work around here. Eventually, he built a larger one several blocks further north than this, but this place, the Marble Palace, became a wholesale store at the time, but in its early days, it was really, in a lot of ways, the original department store. It was the inspiration that Potter Palmer used when he was making a department store in Chicago, the one that eventually became Marshall Field's. So, let's step back just a little bit here, just to show the connections here. This is all right above where the Doctors' Mob took place. Now, usually, as we talked about, The best reason for digging up a dead body was usually to get cadavers for medical schools. When I ask at the beginning of the tours, why would anybody rob a grave, most of the time somebody suggests to get jewelry. That's more of a thing in like ancient Egypt. Not many people were buried with anything valuable by the 19th century because they were also afraid of grave robbers. But one other reason, and one that could potentially pay a lot better than just the 50, 60 bucks a corpse, is holding bodies for ransom. For instance, in 1876, right around the time that A.T. Stewart died, a plot was hatched to steal the body of Abraham Lincoln and sell it for and hold it for ransom. It didn't get very far, but they did get the wooden coffin about halfway out of the sarcophagus. 1891, there would be some ghouls attempting to steal the body of P.T. Barnum. In the 1970s, somebody stole the body of Charlie Chaplin and tried to hold it for ransom. In the 1950s, Eva Peron died, and Evita's body was shuffled back between varying political factions for a long time. The 1890s, when George Pullman died in Chicago, it was reported that he was being buried in steel, concrete, and asphaltum to block anybody from stealing his body and holding it for ransom. Now, we tend to say when we repeat some of these stories that it was really because they were so cruel to their employees or something, but nobody talked about that at the time. They all talked about how they didn't want somebody to turn in to the next A.T. Stewart. So let's talk a little bit here about Alexander Turney Stewart. Now, Alexander Turney Stewart began his merchandising career when he found out that he could sell Irish lace in New York for about 10 times what he was paying for it in Ireland. Started up a merchandising business, worked his way all the way up. Started his department store had a concept like one price for all customers. There wasn't any haggling. Everything was fixed. That was still a fairly new idea in a dry goods shop. Eventually, he was known as a very cold man. He only had a couple of friends, maybe 2 or 3 tops, and most of them weren't all that good of friends to begin with. Here he is picking on a clerk for being wasteful, but also is known to tell his clerks, never cheat a customer even if you can, even if they deserve it. This is sort of like an early version of give the lady what she wants or the customer is always right. Never cheat them even if they deserve it. I disagree with this philosophy, A.T. Stewart, but this is clearly the work of a guy who didn't have to deal with a lot of customers himself. Now, A.T. Stewart was not a guy who was particularly flashy, at least in public appearances. You didn't see him hanging around in clubs. He only posed for one photograph that I know of. It was back before beards became fashionable. So he just kind of sits here looking, frankly, like a goober. One of the reasons people didn't smile in pictures much of this era is they thought they'd look goofy if they smiled in a picture. There you go, A.T. Stewart. But by buying low and selling for just slightly higher and making it all up in volume, being able to keep his prices way below all of his competitors, he made himself an absolute fortune. He grew to have a fortune of something in the range of $40 million, and that's in 1870s money. In the 1990s, somebody took all of those old fortunes and divided them by the GNP and calculated that presently his fortune would be of somewhere in the range of $70 or $80 billion. And that's in 1990s money. So he is generally ranked among the top richest people that America ever had. If you adjust for inflation and everything like that, I mean, he wouldn't be ahead of Rockefeller. Rockefeller's fortune would be in the couple hundred, 300 billion range now. But he would have been slightly richer than Marshall Field at his height. Built himself a mansion with a light moat, like a little recessed ditch area that was all lit up, a light moat to keep the public out, down at 34th and 5th in New York. Let's take a look at the inside of some of this place. This was the entrance hall. I would be terribly afraid that these things were going to come to life and strangle me. Or at least that I would trip over them, geez. This was his art gallery. Now, just for contrast, he was the 3rd richest American of his day. The richest, with a fortune of roughly twice his, was Mr. Astor, who lived across the street at a house that looked like this. Comparatively very modest. Though this one had a ballroom that held 400 people, that's how you knew you were in the social elite of New York City, if you were one of the 400 who got invites to Mrs. Astor's balls. But this is when Fifth Avenue looked about like this, when it was still largely residential. This is what that site looks like right now. A.T. Stewart's place would have been over here on the right where the Duane Reade is now. I think it's a CVS these days. Across the street where the Astors lived is the Empire State Building. Now, it is worth noting that A.T. Stewart was incredibly superstitious. When he moved from the old Marble Palace, he hired the apple woman who sold apples outside to move to his new location because he thought she was good luck. Would not eat at a table that had 13 people at it. This was widely reported at the time. Now, here's a quick ad for one of his businesses. Well, this is his business eventually was also supplying all of the other businesses. Similar to Marshall Field, other department stores advertised that they had goods that were from the line of A.T. Stewart. Like Neil Armstrong & Co. I just like that name, Neil Armstrong & Co., who offer on Tuesday, special bargains on shawls from the stock of A.T. Stewart & Co. Also, Mr. Stewart himself, one of his very best customers was Mary Todd Lincoln. One time he went to a party at the White House and brought Mrs. Lincoln a $2,500 lace shawl. $2,500 in money from back then, that's tens and thousands of dollars worth of a shawl. That is one hell of a shawl. I don't even know how you could make a shawl that was worth that much money unless it was like woven from hairs from the Queen's own butt crack or something. But A.T. Stewart, department store king, merchant prince of Chicago, dealer in the fanciest shawls anywhere, died in 1876. So few photographs of the guy, even the Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper even said one of those drawings I showed before was the only actual drawing that had ever been made of him. They did manage to draw a picture of him in his coffin, lying in state. Now, at the time he was plotting to build a whole town out in Garden City on Long Island. But when he died of a bladder infection and peritonitis in 1876, he was deposited into the vault at St. Mark's of the Bowery. This was a church on the Lower East Side, not too terribly far from his cast iron palace, his second big department store. This is an image from Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper of the body being deposited, the coffin enclosed inside of a wooden case, down into the vault. We'll talk a bit more about the vaults there in a second. We'll also just cover, in his will, most of it went to his wife, Cornelia, except for $1 million to Judge Henry Hilton, about the closest thing that he had to a friend. Now, he became one of the executors of the estate. He eventually traded back. He let Cornelia have that $1 million in exchange for running all of the businesses. A business that he would remarkably quickly run right into the ground, partly by doing things that A.T. Stewart knew were not a good idea, like moving to Chicago. He had always stayed out of the Chicago market. He figured it was already fairly saturated there. There was kind of a gentleman's agreement by some accounts between him and Potter Palmer and Marshall Field. But he purchased a lease on the Duke Block at Washington and Wabash, moved in there, started a price war with Marshall Field, and got run out of town within about 5 years. Within five or 6 years, the entire company was bankrupt. Judge Hilton did such a bad job. We'll cover a bit more of that later on. First of very many bad ideas for Judge Hilton. But this is an old illustration of St. Mark's in the Bowery. Here's the church, here's the steeple. Down below, for scale, here's some people. Now you notice down at the bottom here, the fence kind of goes upward over on this side because it really goes into a hill. The churchyard here doesn't look like a normal graveyard. There aren't gravestones standing up. There's just these little flat stones in the ground. And even here you can't see a single gravestone standing up. But the reason is it's not traditional in-ground burials. By the time they started doing burials here, regular casket burials within Manhattan and lower Manhattan at least were against the law, but burials inside of stone vaults were still okay. Let's just kind of cruise over. Here's St. Mark's as it appears today. You notice the huge slope up here. The ground within is a good 5 feet off of the ground, relative to where you're standing on the sidewalk looking in on 2nd Avenue and 10th. But on the inside, just move that in the wrong way. On the inside, it mostly looks like this. Usually there's a bit more grass than this. But you just see these stones. Underneath these stones are the entrances into the vaults. We'll show some examples in a second. Probably the most famous burial here in Termon is Petrus Stuyvesant and his entire family, about 80 members of the Stuyvesant family. He was the last governor of New Amsterdam before the English took over. About the one thing you can say that's good about Petrus Stuyvesant is that he at least knew when to quit. He didn't put up a fight when the British showed up. He just said, okay, I'll sign the articles, just let me go back to my farm, and then I'll just be out of your hair. Thank you. He is now interred here in this vault, along with, according to the sign outside, several people that he enslaved. Which I like to hear because now when I write about this in the Graveyards of Manhattan book, as far as I'm concerned for the purposes of the book, it's the slave's grave. The Stuyvesants are just also present now. But this is kind of what it looks like, what it would look like. This is at the Marble Cemetery, not too far away. I can get better illustrations of the Marble Cemetery a few blocks out, which is the same kind of concept. You move a flat stone, dig down underneath, and you'll come to a door. And if you come to a door and you look inside, this is also at the Marble Cemetery. On the inside would be shelves inside of a stone vault stacked with coffins. Here's a diagram showing what it was like to get into the A.T. Stewart vault. Up at the top, you've got these 3 paving stones. You have to dig down a little bit to get to those. But you dig, you move them, and then you find yourself coming down into stairs that lead down into the vault where the coffins would have been all lined up. For an image of what these might have looked like on the inside, here's one that they found underneath Washington Square not too long ago. Washington Square was a cemetery at one point, too. Most of the parks in lower Manhattan were burial grounds at one point or another. We'll just wander through St. Mark's a little bit. Let's just take a look at these. They're so high up off of the ground level, off sea level. But right about where the X is here, there's no longer an A.T. Stewart marker here, but this is where he would have been interred in 1876, underneath a stone that said Stewart. But in October of 1878, about 2 years after his death, the sextons came by and saw that the stone had been tampered with. Somebody had moved it around a little bit. So they got suspicious. The chief of police asked them to just move it over several feet. So they reset the stone far away from where the actual vault entrance was. That was kind of a trick. Nobody else knew about this. They hired a guard to watch the place. He wasn't even told about anything like that, or even that Stewart was there. There were 2 sextons at this place. Now remember, rule number 1, always bribe the sexton. The sextons here were named George Hamill and Francis Parker. I cannot find pictures of Hamill or Parker, so we're just going to cast Mark Hamill and Fess Parker in their roles for the purposes of tonight. So, these 2 are about the only people in the vicinity who knew in early November, not only that there had been an attempt of somebody to get into that vault, but also that Stewart was about to be moved. They had finished building the Cathedral of the Incarnation out in Garden City, his planned community for his workers that didn't really take off at the time. As he was going to be moved over here, the whole thing at St. Mark's and the Bowery was only going to be temporary. But November of 1878, early one morning, Sexton Parker walked out and noticed that everything was askew. He noticed there was some weird clay on the locks. He noticed that the stone was all out of whack and there was an abominable stench coming from inside of it. So he looked down and said, "My God, they've done it at last." Or anyway, that's the way the story is retold by the police chief, George Washington Walling, who wrote about the case about a decade later, opened with the vivid scene of Sexton Parker looking down and saying, "My God, they've done it at last." But of course, he wouldn't have been there to see that. He's just kind of guessing. So it took a while before they could even descend into the crypt because the spell coming out of it was just so incredibly offensive. But inside, they found one of the coffins had been carelessly stepped on and was falling apart. Stewart's coffin was busted open. A bit of the coffin lining and the silver nameplate were missing, and so was the body. It would have been set up about like this. The other coffins were all in a row. Stewart's was stepped off on askew. On the ground, they found a patching trowel, a little hand shovel made out of galvanized steel, and a bullseye lantern. One of these things. Now, this was a puzzle for a number of reasons. For one thing, as you saw, it wasn't more rural back then. There were apartments, there were businesses, there were buildings surrounding this place. Now, it was a snowy and rainy night, so that would have kept people inside at least, but there was always a lot going on here. There were guards who wandered around the place. There were sextons. And the best anybody could figure is what these guys must have done is get down on the ground and very slowly scrape away at the ground with the patching trowel. Once they got from that way, they could have eventually, over the course of about an hour or so, dug down to those stones that blocked the staircase. What they couldn't really figure out was how they could have stood the smell. The smell was absolutely disgusting. A.T. Stewart, by his own request, had not been embalmed. Experts who were consulted at the time said that the body probably would have been in good shape inside of the coffin until they opened it, at which point the flesh would have entirely liquefied. The body would have become skeletonized just about like that. It would have been kind of like those Indiana Jones movies where guys just crumble in the dust. So Inspector Delex put out a message. And in this message he said, "The decomposition of the remains is so offensive that they cannot be concealed. The body cannot be taken across ferries or placed anywhere above ground without discovery. Cause diligent search to be made in your precinct." The general sense was this: whatever they had taken out of there must have smelled so bad there's no way they could sneak it anywhere. It had to be nearby someplace. So newspapers jumped on this at once. The New York Herald, "Ghouls at work." And then later on, "Ghouls in New York City" in the New York Times. Within days, "human hyenas." As we've talked about, that was a term for grave robbers back then. Now, Judge Hilton got involved right away, and he immediately said that it must have been Hamill and Parker. It had to have been an inside job. He noticed that the locks had not been messed with. He noticed that most people wouldn't have been able to find the body in the first place. Hamill was quoted as saying, "Well, I can't imagine how anybody knew where it was. Even I, who knew it best, couldn't have gone straight to it the first time on a dark night, as these villains seem to have done." So the St. Mark's Church people got behind the sexton and said, "No, these are men of good character. It couldn't possibly have been them." And then meanwhile, a New York Times reporter noticed that there was a point in the fence where it would have been very easy to sneak through. You didn't need to bust through the locks. So this kind of stopped that line of reasoning that it must have been them. Clues kept on coming in. Clues coming in as fast as shawls on sale. Any amount of them furnished to Judge Hilton by anonymous correspondents. Clairvoyance to the front. So he had some egg on his face here for insisting it must have been the sextons before a reporter figured out, no, somebody easily could have gotten through the fence. Once they got through the fence, in fact, they found a trail of very stinky gunk going through it. They found a copy of the New York Herald that was smeared with all the stinky gunk. It led all the way to a boarding house. Figured that whatever these guys had done, they must have put the body into a bag or something, but it was leaking all the way through the churchyard. They wiped their hands on a copy of the New York Herald, which is exactly the way you should treat a wretched copperhead newspaper like the New York Herald, then got into a wagon near the boarding house nearby, then drove away. Now, trying to save face, the New York Herald and Judge Hilton said, no, that's not stinky decomposing bodies. That's alectin. That's this new kind of chemical that you can get. They must have just popped right in there and injected some alectin right into the body and embalmed him right there on the spot to keep the smell down. And they traced it, and they even found a guy who said, "Yes, I did have a guy come in here just recently trying to buy alectin and the means for injecting it into a body. But I only sell to licensed undertakers, so I turned him away." After he got He said it would have made the body completely inoffensive to the nostrils, but after he got through advertising himself, most people drifted away from it. They did find a guy who he identified from the Rogues Gallery. A young man named McCarty said, yes, that's the guy who tried to buy it from me. Another guy said, yes, I recognize McCarty too. I sold that man a bullseye lantern and a spade not long ago. But the police interviewed him and for whatever reason decided, nah, he wasn't the kind of guy who could have pulled this sort of thing off. He was just a petty thief and a pickpocket. The Herald then landed on a guy who happened to look a bit like McCarty, a professional grave robber from Baltimore named George A. Christian. Now, George A. Christian was running this whole ring. This was the 1870s. As we discuss in Grave Robbing 101, by the 1870s, a lot of the schools were being provided with bodies, but there was still a market if you dug up a body, put it in a barrel, and shipped it off to some other college, like Ann Arbor or in Iowa City, where they weren't getting enough bodies yet. He was running a whole ring out of the Baltimore and D.C. area. Eventually, he would be sentenced to a year in jail, but President Grant pardoned him later on, based on the recommendation of places like Georgetown University, who said he was providing a really important service to them. Another person popped in and said, well, maybe it was phrenologists. No, this was a thing. There was a big market for famous people's heads at the time. Phrenologists thought they could use it to prove their points. George Walling listened to a guy say it must have been phrenologists for a while, then threw him out of the office. But the way that he remembered this case, it went on for about 2 years like this, with just leads that went nowhere coming in. It wasn't really that long. The next portion of the case just came a couple of months later. So we're going to go back to City Hall Park for a second. Just above that, we've got the New York World Building. And the Temple Court Bar over on the left, one of my favorite bars, built into the old phrenological cabinet. And coming up on the right, that's City Hall off in the distance, all lit up. On the right is a building at 150 Nassau Street. This wouldn't have been the same building. This is from the 1890s, about 20 years later, but a building right on this spot would have been the office of a lawyer, a former Ellsworth Zouave named Patrick Henry Jones. Civil War general turned lawyer. He was one of the New York Fire Brigade that Ellsworth recruited early on in the war, rose to the rank of general later on. Had an office right there on the right. Now, not for nothing, I will point out that right near his office, right across the street, would have been Fowler & Wells' phrenological cabinet, where they had one of the best collections of human skulls going. There would have been, on the other side of the park, was St. Paul's Churchyard. This in the front is the vault of Mr. Ling, who I really strongly suspect might have won that vault in a card game from some wealthy sucker. Sucker was his favorite word. And just around the corner was A.T. Stewart's old marble palace. So Patrick Henry Jones was now a lawyer working out in New York, but surrounded by lots of historical sites of grave robbing interest. In fact, his office was right on the route for the New York edition of Grave Robbing 101. One day he got an envelope in the mail to Patrick Henry Jones, Esquire, room 45, with postmarks from various cities, including both New York and Montreal. Now, in this, the guy said, I'm Henry Romaine. I'm one of the people who helped steal the body. What we did was we put it into a grocer's wagon and took it all the way up to 116th Street. Then we put it in a zinc-lined trunk, and it was sent first to Plattsburgh and then to Montreal, all in good shape except that the eyes were gone. Give us $250,000 and you can have the body back. You can communicate with us using these secret coded messages in the New York Herald. This was a favorite method of communications back then, and we've covered this quite a bit, especially on the H.H. Holmes tour. H.H. Holmes also tried to send a coded message, or pretended to, in the Herald. The Herald, on their first page of every issue, had personal ads. And the people would use them for secret codes all the time, like Amethyst, letter at old place, or Commodore, Kate Expressed, elevation to show Wednesday. Come then and all will be forgiven. Fat architect. So, January of 1879, just a couple of months after the body was stolen, following the instructions, P.H. Jones placed this ad saying, Canada, send P. Counsel. P meant proof. He wanted proof that they actually did have the body. And just for chuckles, let's also check this out. English widow, late of 25th Street, 8th Avenue, and just arrived from the south. 8th Avenue car about 1 o'clock yesterday. An admirer would be pleased to become acquainted with a brown-eyed lady with diamond and ruby rings who left car at 17th Street. Address in confidence. I bet you'd like to meet the lady who had diamond and ruby rings. Miss Maria Prickham has requested to send her address. Mrs. Grant will see you Friday. Grant. So they sent this thing. Mr. Romaine sent back what he said was the coffin plate. They got the guy who had made the coffin plate in the first place to say, yeah, that's the one. Also, a little bit of the lining from the coffin was sent in as proof. And then started making arrangements. Okay, I'm actually going to cut the price down to $200,000. So all you have to do is arrange to meet us at a certain place about 25 miles outside of Montreal. We promise that nobody's ever going to talk about this again. And initially he replied and said, okay, we will do business. Canada will do business. And above that, Black Fan Theater, Monday evening. Please address sympathetic neighbor with light beard. Velvet. Velvet. Duval, I leave town Thursday for 8 days. Come Wednesday, usual time. Don't understand silence. Duval. And this guy who's looking for the lady at this 6th Avenue car at 35th Street. If acquaintance of gentleman in a corner would be reasonable, please address impression. These things are a riot. But Judge Hilton got wind of this scheme. He was the one who was supposed to be providing all of this money, teaming up with Cornelia, the widow. And he said, no, absolutely not. We are not giving these people $200,000 for these bones. A.T. Stewart himself would not have paid that sort of money. So finally, P.H. Jones had to send another one saying, Canada, parties refuse to consider the terms proposed and decline any negotiations through personals. Counsel. Also, what just meant blue eyes. I gave newspaper. You said thank you. Do you miss me at mealtime? What a nice guy. This is real classic friend zone behavior stuff here. So this leads us to an important question. Now what? Let's say that you have stolen a body to hold for ransom. You can ask for any amount of money for this sort of thing. There's not a lot of things to go on here, just how much you think they might be willing to pay. But if they decide they don't want to pay, you're just stuck with a dead body on your hands and nothing to do with it. They can really bargain you down about as much as they want. So, meanwhile, Judge Hilton did not want to pay the money, but that still left Cornelia, the widow herself, who within a few months had already moved out of the old mansion. She never liked that place on Fifth Avenue, so she moved out. She is not at all disposed to leave matters entirely to Judge Hilton. She has a mind of her own, and is not chary in expressing it concerning her own affairs to those with whom she comes into contact. So, the story goes, this is the way that the police chief told it, this is the way that it was told in the papers a few years after the fact, after Cornelia's own death. She stepped in, met with Patrick Henry Jones, and said, offer them $20,000. It's a lot less than they had asked for, but still, it's a lot more than you would normally get for one body. So she apparently stepped in, offered the $20,000. They set the same thing up, saying, okay, you don't have to come all the way to Canada. We'll do this out in Westchester. Just send somebody out to meet us. So she sent some relative out there with a whole bag full of cash. This was illustrated twice. Once was in the National Police Gazette, which was always good for a good illustration. But this particular one is just too dark. I made it as light as I could. And there they are, just kind of counting out the money. Or the other version is he went out on a dark night, met them with cash. They showed up, these guys were wearing masks that would have definitely concealed their identity. He gave them a bunch of cash, and they gave him a bag of bones that, according to the official story, was interred underneath a crypt in the Cathedral of the Incarnation out in Garden City. There's a memorial urn to him there now. Cornelia, his wife, was definitely interred there a few years later, and it was announced in the press that there was a special mechanism rigged up known as the Goblin Bells. If the idea was that if anybody ever disturbed the crypt in which the Stewarts were interred, bells would ring out that the entire town would hear. Then one day in 1905, the bells actually did start ringing. Turned out to just be some people who were doing some electrical work and screwed up, but apparently it turned out the bells actually were real. But if anybody ever made an attempt to steal them, it didn't make the news. But even now, the people at the Cathedral of the Incarnation don't go into the crypt. They don't want to set off the bells themselves, and they're not entirely convinced that the body is there themselves. Nobody really is. There are a few different theories. There's this sensational story that came along with a deathbed confession. This was an old farmer out in the Albany region said right after the reported grave robbing of A.T. Stewart, there was a guy who came through town and was seen burying some stinky clothes, and he was said that he smelled so bad because of a skunk. Started doing some work around the area, then he got sick in 1880. On his deathbed, he said he was part of the gang that stole the body of A.T. Stewart. It was not his own grudge. There were some rich kids in the neighborhood who had lost a lot of money gambling and hatched this plot to hire professional grave robbers, including him, who would dig up the body and steal it for them. They hired a resurrectionist for about $10,000 plus some helpers at $1,000 a pop. He was one of the helpers. He said the body was put in a sack and taken up to Canal Street, where it was put in a barrel with a pickling solution to kill the smell, then labeled fish and sent to be buried in the country with McCarthy. Now, the rumor at the time when this came out, it was said that a couple of years later, the farmer had gone digging about where the clothes were supposed to have been buried and found a skeleton, and that was the end of that. But nobody ever really managed to confirm this. It's not worth noting, though, that he said that stranger's name turned out to be McCarthy, which was one of the people, the guy who looked just like G.A. Christian, who was said to have been a suspect at the time. Nobody seemed to have made that connection when this story broke, that there was a guy named McCarty who was a suspect for a while. But at the time, when these stories went around, Judge Hilton's personal secretary, a guy named Anstey, said, no, this is all nonsense. The body has absolutely never been recovered. This is generally the sense that a lot of historians get, that maybe that story was real about them beating the people out in Westchester and giving them $20,000 for a bag of bones, but there'd be no way to tell whether it was actually the bones of A.T. Stewart or not. The story gets even a little bit stranger. Back in the 1950s, very late for any new information to break in something like this, there was a guy by the name of Bernard Cowan. He was a lawyer. Said that he was writing a will in the 1930s for a guy by the name of Terrence Forrest. He was a laundry owner on 45th Street, 95 years old at the time and a really big talker. And he said this guy admitted to him that he was one of the guys who had stolen the body of A.T. Stewart, and it was because when they first came to New York, they came looking for their father's body at Grace Episcopal Church and found out that the church had been torn down to make way for A.T. Stewart's new building, and that they had found bodies underneath but just carted them off someplace. So historically, this doesn't quite work out. Grace Episcopal wasn't in quite the right place, but there was a place, a Baptist church, right where they dug out for the new space. The bodies had already supposedly been moved a couple of years before, but Judge Hilton did admit that when they turned the old church building into A.T. Stewart's stable, they did find a couple of bones. And he said they sent them off to the morgue to be dealt with. They weren't just carted off like that. So there's at least something to the backstory. But this guy's story, Bernard said that this Terrence Forrest guy immediately told him, we made a vow that if our father's bones won't rest because of you, then your bones will never rest in peace either. And he said what they had done was they hadn't even planned to take a ransom for it. They just dug up the body and stole it and buried it in Amityville. I'll just kind of leave that there. But meanwhile, Judge Hilton proceeded to run the fortune entirely into the ground. A couple of years later, he was managing a hotel and banned Jews. So all of the Jewish merchants pulled their accounts from A.T. Stewart. All of the Jewish shoppers pulled their accounts from A.T. Stewart. Dominoes just fell and fell and fell until he had pretty much squandered one of the largest fortunes that had ever been acquired. Here's a cartoon that went in the magazine Puck at the time, showing the ghost of A.T. Stewart looking down in dismay at what a bad job Judge Hilton was doing, driving his work into the ground. So that is the story of A.T. Stewart. Whether the bones were ever actually recovered or not, nobody really knows to this day. But if a part of that story is true, this is about the only case you're likely to find of somebody who actually got away with holding a body for ransom and actually got paid for it. They didn't get as much money as they wanted, not even close. But $20,000 was nothing to shake a stick at in those days, especially that's like 500 bodies that you would get working regularly. And so, everybody, let me give a quick plug for the upcoming editions. Next week, we are going to do the Pride edition of Time Travel Pub Crawls, going to Pride-related bars from throughout history, just in Chicago, mostly in Chicago, but also some in New York. And next in-person tour, well, that should say 22nd up at the top. The next 2 days later, on the 24th, we will be at Graceland Cemetery by special request. I hope to see you all out there. And with that, everybody, we will just turn the Benny Goodman back on and just kind of hang out like we always do. Now accompanied by this cool new neon sign. I'll set it up like this so I don't block the neon. And there we go. There's the Benny. Thanks, Ann. Thanks, everybody. Oh, here, watch this. God, show me a sign! Where should I send money on Venmo? It's a sign! If anybody is new out there, check out the Mysterious Chicago Regulars and Miles fan club page on Facebook. Miles is the cat that you've seen popping in and out. Jennifer, I think so too, except for the fact that they stole some of the coffin lining. That could really only be done to hold up as proof later on. Oh, Octavio. Well, we'll run this again in a few months, I'm sure. Now, it's a cool area just walking around there. It's kind of by Union Square Park. Easy walk from Union Square. We did walk there from Union Square on a mini tour a couple of weeks ago. Are there any famous graves that get vandalized in Chicago? Somebody just spray painted on Al Capone's grave recently. I always say, just dance on it, guys. They're just going to clean it up. Good night, Debbie. Happy birthday.
Put rhythm in the beat of a wooden Indian. That was the bugle call rag, Benny Goodman's own arrangement. Now, the popular tune, Thanks a Million.
Octavio, you're late, young man. You'll never learn to rob graves by being late. You gotta be punctual to rob a grave. Octavio, what do you want to do with your life? Glad to have you. Nice moment. Thanks, everybody. Einbed Ma Lisa. Rodney, I'm just drinking some Buffalo Trace tonight. Well, Octavia, you can always do extra credit. Also, I am the kind of professor who will give you good grades in exchange for bribes. It has been a while since we did a trivia night. Those never generated a lot of donations, so it's kind of a amount of work versus amount of donations fallacy, you know. How long does it take to drive home? It's about a 6 to 7 hour drive, depending on how many stops you make. And I learned the hard way, Perkins only has like one thing of syrup now. They don't bring you out like 9 of them anymore. Are the allergy shots helping? I think so. I'm still very early in my shots. I'm about 20% of the way through. Casey, I have been known to test everybody on this stuff. Were the eyes left behind, or they're probably just disintegrated by then? Well, that's if you believe what the person said. They would have presumably disintegrated. They definitely weren't left behind. But his story was that the body was in good shape except for the eyes, which is really unlikely after 2 years. But the police inspector never believed the story. He didn't think they could have possibly gotten to Montreal as fast as they said they did. Be safe, Gina. Lily is naughty. Lily the cat, our latest move-in, she's naughty. That's what she is. She's great. She's fully blended in. Cuddles a lot, purrs a lot, plays a lot. Gets up on the stove. We can't leave leftovers out for 1 second. Gotta keep everything covered. Katie, I've tried the peanut butter whiskey. I feel like it's best as as an ice cream topping. Good night, Bob.
Benny Goodman presents On the Alamo.
I will talk to the Dead Ringers about it. Dead Ringers will be in town in a couple of months. Good night, Susan. Thank you, Gina. Ah, Kathy, good to hear that. I got a pretty good supply of Coyote pictures moving forward, but I need to get some more. Spent the day researching a famous quilter. She wasn't famous in her day, she only made quilts for family members. But now there's one in the Met. Carol, no, didn't see that. Yes, Jordana, Susan Furman Warner Williams. Contradictory information about her. I think the Met has her birth date wrong. She's one of my Manhattan graveyard people. Really incredible quilts too. Revolutionary use of applique, as I understand it. They do look really cool. One of them that was damaged in a fire at the Henry Ford Museum even appears to show St. Paul's Church, where she is now buried. Also, she largely lived apart from her husband after 1825, the last 20 years of her life. She moved out and went back to New York. He stayed in Vermont.
Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and we stay right in the urban room of the Congress Hotel in Chicago and dance some more to Benny Goodman and his orchestra and hear Helen Ward sing Eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Yes, Sarah Furman Warner Williams. Her middle name is misspelled on the gravestone, which makes it also tricky to make sure I'm looking at the right person. There were a couple of Sarah Williams floating around. I spent all day just making sure it's the same person. But I'd so much rather have a great quilter in the book than another soldier who also owned slaves. We got a lot of those. Difficult to contextualize. Still haven't figured out quite how I want to deal with that in the book. But the anti-slave crackdowns they had in early New York don't really resemble the stuff that went on in the South 100 years later. It's much more like the Salem witch trials. Carol, she was from New York, moved to Vermont with her husband, but then moved back. Jennifer, not at the top of my head. Jordana, that's awesome. Now look up Sarah Furman Warner Williams. There's a good article on a blog about her, some about the War of 1812. It's usually the first one that comes up, I think.
Benny Goodman presenting Madhouse.
The picture of her, I was thinking might not be her, but I think it might just be the date wrong. Because she would have been like 8 when that portrait was drawn. But then again, there's a portrait of her brother by the same guy when he was 5. I'm working on some of her brother's poems. I think they're poems, might just be religious essays. I'm also really unclear on where her brother is buried. Yeah, Jordana, that's the one. She died in the 1840s, which would have been late enough that they might have used the V's instead of U's just to look cool, but not usually. She has one of the most visible graves at St. Paul's. You walk down Broadway, you can see it. It's in front of all the other ones. It's big. It's got 4 verses of epitaph, none of which are legible anymore, but I know what they say. Yeah, I believe, I heard a while ago that hardcore quilters have some name for Joanne's. Slow-Anns, I think? It might have been meaner than that. I think Layla told me after I told her what my punk rock friends used to call Blockbuster the video. This is a family show, I won't repeat it. Kathy, it's difficult to know for sure. A few of them, a few of them, if you really dig into it, the family wrote down who they got it from. So there doesn't seem to be some dispute that she made some of them, at least. It's about time we did After Hours again, yeah.
And here's a short encore portion of Benny Goodman's forthright invitation at the beginning of his program. Let's dance.
Kathy, I've done some tours on Epping. I'll probably do another one pretty soon. This watch band does not match my outfit.
We have been presenting the music of Benny Goodman and his orchestra from the Joseph Urban Room of the Congress Hotel on Michigan Avenue in Chicago. This is the National Broadcasting Company.
All right, everybody, that's Benny wrapping it on up, so I feel as though I should wrap it up as well. Next, we got a time travel pub crawl next week. Then in person, we will be at Graceland Cemetery on June 24th. That's the day before the Pride Parade. So it shouldn't mess up with traffic. But I've done tours there on the day of the Pride Parade when they're staging all of the floats right on Montrose. We have always been able to work around it before. But it's going to be a great tour. It's going to be a great time for everybody. So please come check it out. Also, if you're not on the Patreon, that is still the best value you can get. So everybody, on behalf of Miles and myself and our awesome new neon sign courtesy of Ronnie, thanks everybody for joining me. I'll see you all tomorrow for Find a Grave Friday, wherever we're going. And until then, everybody, make sure you stay spooky. Have a great day, everybody.